The strangest thing about Jovi and Yara at this point is not that people keep asking whether they are still together, it is that the answer somehow manages to sound both clear and unstable at the exact same time. Because every time this relationship looks like it has survived another rough patch. Another comment, another clip, another awkward public moment shows up and makes it feel less like a marriage that is healing and more like a marriage that keeps finding new ways to stay alive without ever looking fully settled, and that is exactly why viewers still lock onto them. Because they are. Not the kind of couple where the drama comes from one explosive betrayal and then a clean ending. They are the kind where the tension sits under everything. Under the smiles, under the updates, under the jokes, under the social media answers, and the longer you watch them, the less the question becomes, are they married? And the more it becomes, what does that marriage even look like when the cameras are off and there is no reunion couch, no cash trip, no therapy setup, no producer pushing the conversation forward? That is what makes this feel so slippery. Because on the surface, there is still a public relationship, still a shared history, still a family. Still enough evidence for fans to say maybe they are fine, maybe people are reading too much into it, maybe this is just what a long reality TV marriage looks like after years of pressure, but the other side of that argument never really goes away. Because every so-called update seems to carry a second message inside it, and that second message is that whatever peace exists between them never feels deep, it feels temporary, conditional almost, negotiated. Like they are not standing on solid ground so much as standing on something that keeps shifting under their feet, while both of them try not to be the first one who admits it. And that is where the real tension starts. Not with some giant scandal, not with a courtroom fantasy people throw together online, because humans cannot resist turning every bad marriage into a crime documentary, but with contradiction. Because contradiction is what keeps this couple alive as a story they keep getting presented as surviving, but the details around them keep sounding like two people who do not experience marriage the same way, and once viewers sense that split, everything starts feeling different. Even the normal stuff. Even the casual answers, even the public humor. Because now every small moment gets read as evidence, every shrug feels loaded, every joke feels like cover, every dry response sounds less like playfulness and more like exhaustion. Jovi, fairly or unfairly, often comes across like someone who can live inside the moment and assume the bigger emotional consequences will smooth themselves out later, and that quality can read as fun when the relationship is working, but when it is not working, it reads as careless, impulsive, and oddly detached from the emotional aftershock he leaves behind. While Yara often reads like someone who wants to know where she stands before she relaxes, someone who wants stability to feel real before she fully trusts it. And that difference matters more than any one argument because it shapes how both of them interpret the same marriage. One person can think we are still here, so we are still okay, while the other can think we are still here, but that does not mean I feel safe. And that gap right there is where so much of their tension lives. That is also why the public question never dies. Because when people ask if they are still together, what they are really asking is whether the relationship has substance or just extension, whether it is actually rebuilding, or whether it is simply moving forward because neither person has fully chosen to end it, and those are not the same thing at all. A relationship can continue long after its emotional logic has started breaking down, especially when there is a child, a public image, a shared platform, and years of history involved, and with Jovi and Yara, that possibility always hovers over the conversation. Because the relationship does not look cleanly broken, but it also does not look comfortably repaired. The phrase that keeps haunting their public image is basically that idea of being together on paper, because it captures the exact mood around them. A kind of technical survival without emotional certainty, and once viewers hear that kind of energy, they stop trusting the surface. They stop looking at the existence of the marriage as proof that the marriage is healthy. And they start asking harder questions, like whether love is still the thing holding this together, or whether routine, family structure, public expectation, and mutual exhaustion are doing more of the work now than anyone wants to admit. And the more you sit with that, the more uncomfortable it gets, because this does not feel like a couple whose issue is just one bad season or one unresolved fight that got stretched for TV. It feels like two people who may want marriage in completely different forms, because one version of marriage is more flexible, more improvisational, more willing to keep things moving and assume the bond can survive strain, while the other version is more security-based, more cautious, more focused on consistency, reassurance, and feeling emotionally protected. And when those two versions collide often enough, the result is not always a dramatic breakup. Sometimes it is something harder to read and honestly more interesting to watch. A relationship that keeps going while quietly draining both people in different ways. This is where the audience starts splitting too. Because some viewers see a couple that has been through pressure, distance, parenting stress, and public scrutiny, and they think, of course, it looks messy. Real marriages do look messy, especially when TV gets involved. But another group sees a pattern of public discomfort, vague answers, emotional imbalance, and recurring uncertainty, and thinks, no, this is not just ordinary marriage strain, this is a relationship that keeps exposing the same weakness from different angles, and that fan divide actually makes the story stronger. Because it turns the couple into a live argument, not just a storyline. People are not only watching Jovi and Yara, they are using Jovi and Yara to debate what counts as love, what counts as disrespect, what counts as staying, and what counts as settling. That is why even the calmer updates do not calm anything down. Because when a relationship has built this much suspicion around its emotional core, reassurance stops working the way it used to. In fact, sometimes reassurance makes it worse, because if viewers already think the marriage is shaky, then every attempt to present stability gets examined for cracks. People start listening for hesitation, looking for emotional distance, measuring tone, reading body language, comparing old versions of them to newer ones, and once that happens, the relationship no longer controls its own image. The audience starts helping write the meaning of every moment. And to be fair, that kind of pressure would wear down almost anyone, but this is also what makes Jovi and Yara impossible to dismiss, because they are not flat, they are not easy, and they are not cleanly moving in one direction. They keep creating this weird mix of attachment and doubt, where you can believe there is still something real there and still believe that something is deeply off. And those two ideas are not canceling each other out anymore. They are feeding each other. Because sometimes the most unstable relationships are not the ones that end fast, they are the ones that keep surviving without ever resolving the reason viewers stopped trusting them in the first place. So when people ask whether the split rumors are exaggerated or earned, the honest answer is that the rumors have power because the emotional uncertainty is already there. And when people ask whether the last resort or any past effort really fixed anything, the more honest question may be whether those efforts solved the root issue at all or just helped them stay together a little longer without changing the deeper mismatch. Because if one person wants peace through freedom and the other wants peace through security, then every update, every disagreement, every period of distance, every public awkward moment is going to keep reopening the same wound in a slightly different shape. And that is where this story gets more serious than just gossip. Because the real issue may not be whether one of them said the wrong thing, posted the wrong thing, or handled one rough season badly. The real issue may be that Jovi and Yara do not just fight differently, they may actually define marriage differently, and if that is true, then this relationship was never going to be decided by one rumor or one public answer. It was always going to come down to something much bigger. Whether two people who love each other in some form can survive wanting completely different emotional lives under the same roof. What makes Jovi and Yara harder to dismiss than a normal reality TV couple is that once you get past the public awkwardness and the split rumor chatter, the real problem starts looking much less like random arguing and much more like a marriage built on a basic disagreement about how life is supposed to feel every day. Because the version of this relationship that keeps playing out across the franchise has never just been about who said the wrong thing in one episode or who embarrassed the other one at the wrong dinner. It has been about distance, routine, parenting pressure, and the kind of emotional imbalance that grows slowly enough to be normalized until one day it stops looking like stress and starts looking like the whole structure of the marriage. Public coverage around them reflects exactly that pattern, especially around his extended work absences and their conflict over timing for another child, which is why this part of their story matters more than any flashy rumor ever could. Because once a couple keeps returning to the same pressure points, you have to stop treating those points like side issues, and with Jovi and Yara, the biggest one has always been the life built around his job. Not just because he works away from home for long stretches, but because that schedule changes the emotional math of everything else. It changes what parenting feels like. It changes what support feels like. It changes what loneliness feels like, and it changes what promises mean. Because a husband being gone for weeks at a time is not just a scheduling inconvenience. It turns one partner into the daily manager of real life, while the other partner can slip into a role that still matters, still provides, still counts, but does not carry the same minute-by-minute emotional and practical burden, and that imbalance can slowly poison a marriage even when both people can technically defend their side. Yara herself has spoken in the franchise about how his schedule left her feeling lonely, while reporting around the couple has tied their story to that same pattern of long work absences. That matters because it changes how viewers should read her frustration, since it is very easy for people to reduce her to the more demanding spouse who is never fully satisfied, never fully calm, never fully reassured, but that reading becomes lazy once you place her inside the actual daily setup. Because what she seems to want is not some fantasy of perfection, it is predictability. It is emotional continuity. It is the ability to build a family life that does not always feel like she is bracing for the next stretch of being mostly on her own again. And when you watch her through that lens, her caution stops looking like coldness and starts looking like self-protection. The kind that develops after too many cycles of being told everything will be fine, while still feeling like the person left holding the emotional weight when life becomes difficult. Jovi, on the other hand, can easily look like the partner who thinks effort should count even when the conditions never really change. And to be fair, in his mind, it probably does count. Because from his perspective, he may see himself working hard, providing, coming back, participating, wanting the family to grow, wanting closeness, wanting the marriage to feel warm and secure, and then looking at Yara and reading her hesitation as distance, resistance, or even lack of gratitude, but that is exactly where the deeper incompatibility sits, because he seems to want emotional reassurance, without consistently reducing the source of her insecurity, and that is one of those relationship traps that can keep a couple stuck for years, because one person says, "Why are you still worried?" while the other person is thinking, "Because the reason I was worried never actually went away." That is why the issue of another child becomes such a revealing pressure point. Because on paper, it can sound like a basic family disagreement about timing, but emotionally, it exposes almost everything, since for Jovi, another child can read as expansion, progress, the next step, maybe even proof that the relationship is solid enough to grow, while for Yara, the same idea can feel like adding weight to a system that already feels uneven. And once a couple reaches that kind of disagreement, it is no longer really about the child alone. It becomes a fight about whether the current life is trustworthy enough to build on, whether the present feels safe enough to multiply, and whether one partner is asking for a bigger commitment before solving the smaller but more painful instability already sitting in the house. Reporting tied to their story has specifically highlighted that conflict over having another child and linked it to the strain caused by his work pattern. That is where the narrative shifts from symptoms to structure. Because if the audience keeps seeing distance, resentment, and repetitive arguments, the easy explanation is that they just clash a lot. But the stronger explanation is that they are living inside conditions that keep producing the same emotional result, and this is what makes the marriage feel more fragile than it first appears, even when there is no explosive scandal in front of it. Because a structural problem does not need a huge betrayal to keep doing damage. It can wear the relationship down quietly through routine, through mismatch, through the endless friction of one person asking for more trust while the other is still trying to recover from never feeling fully secure in the first place. And once that clicks, Yara's resistance to full emotional surrender starts to make a lot more sense. Because if daily life has trained her to feel like stability is temporary, then of course she is going to hold back before fully relaxing into his version of the future. Of course she is going to hesitate before saying yes to more children, more dependence, more softness, and more belief, because people do not usually become controlling or guarded out of nowhere. They become that way when unpredictability has taught them that calm can vanish quickly, and if that is the emotional lesson she is absorbed from this marriage, then her behavior is not random at all. It is adaptive. At the same time, Jovi's side of the loop is just as important, because if he experiences himself as a husband who keeps showing up, who keeps trying to reconnect, who keeps imagining a bigger family and a more bonded home, then Yara's caution may feel like rejection rather than fear. And once he reads it that way, the marriage enters the kind of cycle that drains both people. Because the more he wants reassurance, the more pressure she feels to offer trust she does not genuinely feel, and the more she holds back because life still feels unstable, the more he feels denied and misunderstood, and suddenly both people can honestly believe they are reacting to the other person's failure while completely missing how the system between them keeps reproducing the same wound. That is why this relationship gets more interesting and more uncomfortable the longer you sit with it. Because it may not be broken mainly by lack of love, and that is what makes it harder. It may be strained by different definitions of what makes love livable. Because some people can live on attachment, chemistry, family identity, and the belief that the bond matters enough to survive disruption, while other people need consistency, emotional safety, and practical support before that bond feels trustworthy, and if those needs do not line up, then even real affection starts to feel unstable. Not fake exactly, but insufficient. This is also where the motherhood versus freedom divide becomes the real line in the sand. Because for Yara, the issue does not seem to be motherhood by itself. It seems to be the cost of motherhood inside a marriage where she does not always feel fully carried, fully partnered, or fully reassured. And that distinction is huge, because viewers often hear a child disagreement and rush to frame one person as selfish or one person as pushy, but what is really being negotiated here is not just whether they want another baby, it is whether she trusts the life around that baby enough to survive it without losing herself, and that is a far sharper question than the surface version people usually argue about. So when people wonder whether they are rebuilding or repeating, this is why the answer stays muddy. Because repetition can look like rebuilding for a while if the emotions are softer and the fights are less explosive, but if the root issue stays in place, then the relationship is not actually moving forward in the way people hope. It is just finding more polished ways to circle the same wound, and that may be what keeps making every update sound shakier instead of stronger, not because nothing good exists between them, but because every improvement still seems to sit on top of the same unresolved mismatch about security, duty, closeness, and what a functioning marriage is supposed to feel like on ordinary days. And once viewers see that, they stop needing a giant scandal to believe the marriage is under strain. Because the more unsettling possibility is that it may be unstable even without one. That the real risk is not one catastrophic moment, but a pattern that keeps asking both people to live in a version of marriage that does not fully meet their emotional terms, and if that is true, then the next public incident, the next awkward post, the next fan debate, the next off-show embarrassment is not going to land like a random mistake at all. It is going to land like evidence of character, evidence of mismatch, evidence that the public weirdness people keep laughing at may actually be coming from something much older and much harder to fix than rumors ever were. The moment a relationship already looks shaky, a public incident stops being just a public incident and starts feeling like a character test. And that is exactly why the Nobu mess mattered more than it normally would have. Because if Jovi had been attached to a completely stable marriage and a calmer public image, most people would have treated it like one more sloppy celebrity-adjacent restaurant argument, annoying, embarrassing, probably immature, then over. But when the person at the center of it is already tied to years of marriage tension, awkward public energy, and a fan base that does not fully trust the emotional state of the relationship, the whole thing lands differently. Because now viewers are not just asking what happened at dinner, they are asking whether this is who he becomes under pressure, and whether Yara is stuck being linked to fallout she did not create. TMZ reported that Jovi was removed from Nobu New Orleans after an argument over Wagyu dumplings, and later coverage built off that reporting, while also noting how quickly the clip turned into a wider fan debate about his behavior and credibility. And that is the key shift in this part of the story. Because up to this point, people could still argue mostly about the marriage, about communication, about loneliness, about timing, about whether they wanted the same future, but once a public confrontation enters the picture, especially one he filmed and pushed into the public himself, the audience starts making a harsher kind of judgment. Because filming a dispute with staff and turning it into a public case for your own innocence is not just a bad night, it is an attempt to control the narrative in real time, and whether people agree with him or not. That kind of move instantly splits the room. Some viewers see a guy standing up for himself after bad service. Some see a man acting entitled in public. Some think the staff overreacted. Some think he embarrassed himself. And that kind of split is deadly in the best possible way for commentary, because it stops the audience from passively consuming the story and forces them to choose what kind of person they think he is. TMZ said Jovi claimed the issue involved being charged for dumplings his group never received, while the manager in the video pushed back and said he was being disrespectful, and follow-up coverage emphasized that fan reaction broke sharply in different directions. That division matters because when a couple is already under strain, behavior like this does not stay local to the incident, it bleeds straight back into the marriage. Because people start connecting dots, whether those dots are fair or not, and once they do, the question becomes a lot uglier. Then can they fix this? Because now it turns into, is this simply what he is like when things do not go his way? Is this impulsive defensiveness just part of the package? And if it is, what does that mean for a wife who already seems tired of instability, public awkwardness, and emotional labor she did not ask for? That is the part people often miss when they watch reality TV couples too casually. Because one partner's public behavior does not just damage that person's image, it drags the other partner into a social position they may not have chosen, where they either look supportive of something messy, silent about something messy, or trapped next to something messy, and none of those options are especially flattering. The public details of the Nobu night only make that worse, because even in the softer version of events, even if you strip out every allegation that cannot be independently confirmed and stick only to the broad outline that multiple outlets repeated, you still end up with a scene where Jovi and his group had a confrontation with restaurant staff, where he recorded the argument, where security got involved, and where the clip went public fast enough to turn into another fan spectacle. TMZ reported that Jovi was there with 4 friends, that the disagreement intensified after staff said the dumplings were unavailable and raised concerns about someone in the group, and that security escorted the group out after the argument. Entertainment Now summarized the same core dispute while noting that the story spread largely because Jovi himself posted footage. That kind of public chaos is not neutral when attached to someone like Jovi. Because his image has never really been built around steadiness, it has been built around risk, nightlife energy, joking too far, partying too hard, and then trying to talk his way back into a more sympathetic frame afterward, and sometimes that works when the stakes are low, but once viewers are already questioning whether your marriage is emotionally secure, the same quality stops reading as carefree and starts reading as immature, and that is where this gets uncomfortable for him. Because a lot of fans know. Longer watch his public behavior as isolated episodes, they watch it as evidence, not proof of one giant scandal, but proof of temperament, proof of priorities, proof of whether he is still the kind of husband who creates the instability and then expects the relationship to absorb it. And this is exactly where Yara's silence becomes part of the drama even when she says very little. Because in a situation like this, silence is not empty, Silence gets interpreted, and when she does not rush out to publicly defend him, some viewers read that as distance, some read it as wisdom, some read it as quiet frustration, and some read it as a woman who is simply tired of having to explain behavior that should not need explaining in the first place. Later commentary around the incident specifically noted that Yara was not visibly involved and remained quiet publicly, which only fed speculation rather than calming it. That is why the restaurant controversy starts functioning like an X-ray for the marriage, because whether the dumpling argument itself was minor or not is almost beside the point. What matters is what it exposes about how the audience now sees them, and the audience increasingly does not see them as a couple having ordinary rough patches. It sees them as a couple where public embarrassment keeps circling back, where off-screen behavior keeps feeding on-screen doubts, and where every fresh controversy gets folded into a larger story about whether Yara is married to a man she can actually trust to move through public life without creating another problem she then has to emotionally absorb. This is also where the fan split gets even more useful, because the people defending him do not just defend the facts, they defend the interpretation. They say restaurants mess up, staff can be rude, customers are allowed to complain, videos never show the whole story, and all of that is broadly true. But the people criticizing him are not only reacting to one video either, they are reacting to accumulated pattern, to the sense that this is one more moment where his instinct seems to be escalation, performance, and narrative control instead of restraint, and once a viewer has that interpretation in mind, every new clip confirms it further, even if the raw incident could have been read more charitably in isolation. Complex's write-up captured that broader backlash, noting that the scene spiraled because staff claims and public reactions challenged Jovi's own framing of the event. And that is where the moral tension gets sticky, because this is no longer just about whether he was right or wrong at Nobu. It becomes about what kind of behavior people are willing to excuse once they already think a marriage is under stress, because the more fragile the relationship looks, the less patience viewers have for public recklessness, and the more they start wondering whether Yara's bigger issue is not even one fight, one disagreement, or one family plan, but the possibility that she is tied to someone whose judgment keeps making ordinary life harder than it needs to be. That is a brutal thought for a viewer to arrive at, but once they do, the stakes rise fast. Because embarrassment is not harmless forever, at some point embarrassment starts to erode trust, and once public embarrassment enters a marriage often enough, it stops being funny content and starts feeling like a warning. So the deeper question underneath the restaurant clip is not did he overreact over dumplings, it is whether the controversy revealed something he cannot easily hide anymore. Some deeper immaturity problem, some reflex toward defensiveness, some need to win the moment even if it makes the bigger picture worse. And if that is the read people walk away with, then Yara is not just in a marriage with ordinary conflict, she is in a marriage where public credibility itself becomes unstable, where every messy external moment threatens to confirm the internal fear that peace with him may never stay peaceful for very long. And that is why this incident matters as more than tabloid filler. Because once image starts wobbling on the outside, status often wobbles next, and when that happens, the entire relationship balance changes, because the real power shift is not in the argument with the manager, it is in what comes after, when the man who already looks emotionally risky also starts looking less secure in the parts of his life that once helped offset that risk, and the second work, image, and credibility begin slipping at the same time, the marriage stops being just emotionally tense and starts becoming structurally dangerous in a whole new way. The moment Jovi's job situation starts looking unstable, the entire marriage stops feeling like the same story. Because up until then, a lot of the strain could still be sorted into a familiar category. A husband who has gone too much. A wife who feels alone too often. A family that keeps trying to grow inside a routine that does not really support that growth. But once the job itself starts slipping, or once he starts publicly talking like the structure that defined him for years is no longer there in the same way, the old logic breaks down. And that is where the pressure gets much heavier. Because now the marriage is not just dealing with absence anymore, It is dealing with presence, and presence is not automatically healing when the relationship underneath has already been worn thin by distance, resentment, and too many unresolved questions. Public reporting tied to Jovi's recent storyline has circulated around him saying it was the first day in 17 years that he did not have a job, which is exactly the kind of update that sounds simple on the surface, but changes the emotional math of everything underneath it. Oz, for years, his work was not just something he did, it was part of the whole system that explained the marriage, defended the marriage, and delayed certain confrontations inside the marriage. It gave him a reason to be gone, a reason to frame himself as providing, a reason to justify the practical imbalance at home, and maybe even a reason to avoid fully sitting inside the emotional consequences of that imbalance. And when a job like that starts wobbling, even temporarily, the question is not only how much money is coming in, the question becomes what happens when the excuse weakens and the person is suddenly forced to stand more fully in the life he used to move in and out of. That is the hidden pressure here, because a lot of couples convince themselves that the problem is distance alone, and then when distance shrinks, they expect closeness to rush in and fix everything, but sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the less distance there is, the more visible the actual emotional damage becomes. And that possibility is brutal for a marriage like this one. Because if Yara has spent years feeling like she carried the daily load while Jovi came and went according to a work structure that always seemed bigger than the relationship itself, then him being around more does not automatically feel like relief, not unless the quality of that presence changes too. Because physical presence without emotional reliability can actually feel more frustrating than absence, especially if one partner has built up years of loneliness, resentment, and caution, and the other partner still wants credit simply for being there. That is where the role confusion starts, because once the job weakens, Jovi can no longer rely on the same identity frame that used to stabilize him, the hardworking provider. The guy whose absences had a professional reason. The man whose long stretches away were tied to sacrifice and income. And if that identity slips, then suddenly he is not just a husband under pressure, he is a husband whose old defense mechanism is no longer holding the same weight. That matters because work for someone like Jovi may have been doing far more than bringing in money. It may have been providing routine, distance, status, ego structure, and a clean explanation for why the marriage felt lopsided, and once that is gone or visibly shaken, he has to face a much rougher question. Was the job really the core problem, or was it also the shield that kept him from having to confront the deeper reasons the relationship never quite felt safe to Yara? That is the kind of question people avoid because it cuts straight through comforting narratives. Because it is easy to tell yourself, we would be better if I were home more. But it is much harder to ask whether home itself has become a place where both people are already carrying too much. Frustration for more time together to help unless something more fundamental changes first. And from Yara's side, this shift is just as loaded. Because for years the absence was painful, but it was also predictable in a weird way. She knew the pattern, she knew the cost, she knew what kind of support she was not getting, she knew what she had to mentally prepare for, and when that pattern changes, it does not just create hope, it also creates a new test. Because now she gets to see whether the version of Jovi she has been waiting on actually exists. Whether more time at home means more partnership, more maturity, more steadiness, more emotional responsibility, or whether it just means the same person is now standing closer while the same imbalance remains in place. That is why this phase of the story feels like a power shift even if nobody says it out loud. Because the old arrangement let Jovi keep a certain kind of leverage. The leverage of work, the leverage of earning, the leverage of being able to position himself as the one whose absence was necessary. But when that weakens, Yara's judgment becomes more important than ever. Because now the question is not whether she can endure the system they had, the question is whether she believes the system changing actually makes the marriage safer, and that is a much more dangerous test for him. Because if he stays home more and still does not make her feel secure, then the problem was never only the schedule, and once she sees that clearly, it becomes much harder to keep pretending the future just needs minor adjustments. This is also where fear of collapse starts creeping in more openly. Because unstable work does not only threaten income, it threatens identity and mood, and when identity gets hit, People often become more reactive, more insecure, more defensive, especially if they were already struggling in another part of life, and that means the marriage can easily become the place where those pressures spill out, where a man who used to be buffered by work is now sitting face to face with his own frustration more often, where a woman who used to complain about absence may now realize that presence is not the soothing fix she hoped it would be, and where both people start seeing each other in a new light that can either open the door to real change or make the whole thing crack faster than before. What makes this harder is that viewers often oversimplify this kind of turning point. They say maybe him being home will save them, maybe losing the job will make him focus on family, maybe this is the wake-up call, and that can happen in some marriages, but with Jovi and Yara, the safer read is that job disruption does not create transformation on its own. It only removes cover, it forces truth closer to the surface, and if the truth under the surface is that he still wants emotional reassurance without fully carrying the burden that would make reassurance easier for her, then all the extra time in the world is not going to solve much. On the other side, if Yara has reached the point where caution has hardened into emotional withdrawal, then even genuine effort from him may arrive too late or land too weakly to repair what has been building for years. That is why the job question becomes such a revealing stress test, because it reframes every earlier argument, even the child issue, even the loneliness issue, even the public behavior issue, because now we can ask more honestly what they were really fighting about all along. Was work truly the source of the distance, or was work the shape the distance took? Was the long schedule the marriage's biggest enemy? Or was it the environment that allowed deeper incompatibilities to stay partially hidden? And if the answer leans toward the second one, then this is the point where both of them have to confront something much more serious than inconvenience. They have to confront whether they can actually become different inside the same relationship. And that is the partial answer this stage starts giving. Not a clean yes and not a clean no. Because the marriage does not look doomed simply because of one public restaurant fight, or one work update, or one season of emotional strain, but it also does not look safe simply because the old pattern is changing. And that is the trap couples like this fall into. They wait for one external change to do the inner work for them. Less travel, more time, more family focus, more public calm, but the deeper reality is that none of those changes matter unless the people inside the marriage become more honest, more reliable, more emotionally usable to each other than they have been so far. So by the end of this stage, the pressure has shifted completely. Because now the real issue is no longer whether Jovi and Yara can survive one more round of chaos. They have already shown they can survive chaos. The real issue is whether survival means anything if it does not come with transformation. Whether Jovi can be more than the man whose identity used to shield him from full accountability. Whether Yara can still imagine safety with him instead of just endurance beside him. And whether this marriage is being stretched by circumstance or finally exposed by it. That is the question sitting over everything now. Because once work, image, and emotional trust all start wobbling at the same time, the relationship is not judged by what happened to it. It is judged by whether either of them can become different people before the old version of the marriage run. Out of road.by the time you get to the end of Jovi and Yara's story as it exists right now, the cleanest answer is also the least dramatic one. Which probably annoys the part of the internet that wants every reality TV marriage to end with handcuffs, betrayal charts, and a fake courtroom montage, because the truth is more uncomfortable than that, and also more useful, which is that Jovi and Yara's marriage is compelling precisely because it has not fully collapsed and has not fully healed either. It keeps living in that ugly middle space where two people stay together long enough for viewers to assume they must be repairing something. But the pattern underneath keeps suggesting that survival and repair are not the same thing at all. Public reporting after their major franchise strain has continued to describe them as still together or still married, including later coverage of their status after Happily Ever After, Season 9, but that same reporting also leaves no clean sense that their deeper issues were fully resolved. And that is the real payoff to the central question that has been hanging over everything. Because if the question was ever just, are they still together, then technically the answer is the easy part. Yes, publicly they have still been presented that way in recent coverage, and even fan-facing. Update pieces keep describing them as married or together while continuing to revisit the same old pressure points around tension, family expansion, and emotional strain. But that answer only matters for about 3 seconds before the more important question comes back harder, which is whether being together means the marriage is actually safer, stronger, calmer, or more emotionally reliable than it was before, and that is where the story gets honest, because nothing in the pattern around them suggests some fully settled, fully repaired, finally peaceful version of this relationship has arrived and locked into place. That matters because a lot of couples in public life get misunderstood in one of two lazy ways. Either people declare them doomed too early because the conflict is visible, or people declare them healed too quickly because the breakup never comes, and Jovi and Yara sit right between those two. Bad reads, because they are not a couple you can dismiss as already over, but they are also not a couple you can confidently point to as proof that working through problems automatically creates stability. In fact, the more accurate read is that they have kept choosing continuation without clearly proving transformation, and those are two very different things, because continuation means neither person has fully let go, while transformation means the relationship itself has changed enough to stop producing the same emotional damage in slightly different forms. That is why the earlier retreat-style repair efforts and televised attempts at working through things never feel like a full answer now, because even if they help them stay in the marriage, they do not seem to have erased the deeper mismatch that kept coming back through different topics. First through distance, then through parenting pressure, then through public awkwardness, then through trust questions, then through work and identity disruption. And that repetition is the point. Because once the same emotional problem keeps reappearing in new costumes, you have to stop calling it a temporary issue and start calling it a pattern. Recent write-ups still connect their marriage story to old unresolved conflicts such as his desire for another child and her hesitation given his work history and the imbalance at home, which is exactly why the relationship still reads as active but fragile rather than solved. And this is where the psychological clarity gets sharper. Because Jovi, at least in the way this whole arc has played out publicly, often seems to want forgiveness before transformation is complete, or reassurance before the conditions that make reassurance possible have been fully rebuilt. And that does not mean he has no feelings or no attachment. It means his instinct often reads like someone who wants the emotional reward of being accepted back into safety before he has fully become a person who feels safe enough to trust without reservation. While Yara reads like someone who wants proof before vulnerability is safe, proof that daily life will feel steadier, proof that she will not be left carrying the practical and emotional burden again, proof that trust is not just being requested from her as a gesture, but supported by actual change in the environment around her. That combination creates a marriage that can absolutely continue, but it continues on probation. And probation is not peace, it is just a less explosive form of uncertainty. That is why the answer to whether the real issue was one rumor, one fight, one public embarrassment, or one rough season has to be no, because none of those individual moments were ever big enough on their own to explain why the marriage keeps feeling unsettled. What explains it is cumulative. Mismatch, repeated proof that these two people may want marriage in different emotional terms. He seems more willing to treat staying together as evidence that things are basically intact, while she seems more likely to treat staying together as something that still needs to earn emotional safety over time. And those are not interchangeable mindsets, because one partner can feel encouraged by continuity while the other still experiences that same continuity as fragile and conditional. So when people ask whether the marriage is over, the honest answer is not necessarily. But that does not make the foundation stable. And that distinction is the whole story now. Because there are relationships that end in one giant explosion, and there are relationships that wear down through repeated unresolved mismatches, and Jovi and Yara feel much closer to the second type, which is why they remain interesting even without a clean catastrophe. The tension is not that they already broke, the tension is that they keep not fully breaking while still not fully settling. And, for a viewer, that is almost more compelling, because it feels like you are watching a bond survive without ever fully graduating into emotional certainty. Even the recent side stories fit that same conclusion if you look at them the right way. Because the Nobu incident mattered not because dumplings are the center of anyone's destiny, obviously, but because it reinforced the sense that public embarrassment still follows them too easily. And his job disruption narrative mattered not just because of money, but because it challenged one of the old structures that had long shaped the marriage and forced a new question about whether more presence would create more closeness or simply expose more friction. TMZ reported the Nobu blowup in February 2026, and recent coverage has also circulated around Jovi publicly saying it was his first day in 17 years without a job, both of which mattered because they added pressure to a relationship already defined by imbalance and scrutiny. And once you line all of that up, the final insight becomes pretty hard to dodge. Because this marriage did not become compelling because of one explosive event, it became compelling because it keeps forcing the same deeper question from different angles. Can two people stay together when what? Each of them needs to feel married is not quite the same thing, and maybe the hardest answer here is that yes, they can stay together, people do it all the time, but staying together is not the finish line people pretend it is. Sometimes it only means the relationship still has attachment, history, family structure, or unfinished hope inside it, and all of those things can keep a marriage alive long after they stop making it feel emotionally secure. So the real resolution here is not they made it, and it is not they are done. It is that they are together but not settled, connected but not fully cleared, functioning but not fully repaired, and once you see that, the whole story stops being about trying to catch one final scandal and starts becoming about whether either of them can actually become different enough for the relationship to stop recycling the same old damage in updated form. That is the part viewers should leave with, not the cheap fantasy that one headline ends everything, but the harder truth that some marriages do not fall apart in one spectacular collapse. They thin out through repeated mismatches until survival itself starts getting mistaken for healing. And that is why the next real test is not going to be another vague Instagram answer, another reunion moment, another public defense, or another rumor spike. The next real test is much quieter than that, and much more revealing. Because what will actually tell us something is whether life gets less chaotic and they still know how to like each other, trust each other, and live with each other when crisis is no longer doing the work of keeping the relationship emotionally charged. Because a lot of unstable couples know how to survive storms, but the ones that are really in danger are often the ones who have no idea what to do with calm once it arrives.